Paul Moss, Principal Workplace Relations Advocate at the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of WA. Under the Work Health and Safety Act, the principal obligation rests with the business. Whilst workers do have some accountability for their actions, it is the employers who are ultimately held accountable for any failings, even when it should be obvious to a person that their actions may pose a risk. Even in situations where the majority of workers do the right thing, businesses still need to take action to prevent the minority from placing the safety of others at risk. This is particularly the case when it comes to the misuse of drugs, be they either illicit prescription or over-the-counter medication. And this continues to be a problem for businesses across all industry sectors. In order to help protect the safety of workers in particularly high-risk industries, most employers have adopted a zero-tolerance approach to illicit drugs and alcohol. And in the case of prescription and other medications, consideration is given to the potential impact of the medication on the person's capacity to safely perform their role.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I believe that the Chamber of Minerals and Energy put in a submission, but declined to appear today?
That's correct,
That's
yes.
correct, yes. Now, your submission stated that THC has a strong psychoactive effect, okay, which clearly would lead to a performance impairment.
Yes.
Okay. Is that view based on recreational cannabis or medicinal cannabis?
So the bulk of our views are predominantly premised on the recreational use or illicit use of cannabis products. That has been our greatest experience in that respect. There has been, as far as we're aware, no particular use of medicinal cannabis products in high-risk work sites. Our current appreciation is that those people who, for whose conditions are most likely to be prescribed such products are unlikely to also be able to engage in those high-risk work elements as well. So we don't have sufficient information to gauge whether or not medicinal cannabis products are safe to utilise or not. We would be very much reliant upon the advice of medical practitioners in order to, and also the product manufacturers to clearly identify what limitations might apply when someone is utilising.
Just a follow-up question to that, because I'm seeing a problem here in that, on the one hand, you're looking to detect illicit use of say, cannabis, okay? But on the other hand, you're also saying we can't accept people using medicinal cannabis because they might be using it to mask their illicit use. So then the advice you get from the doctor is that this is a safe substance to use, won't carry any weight with you based on what you've just said.
And that's the issue, that the limitations within the testing regime in detecting some drugs, and cannabis is particularly one of those, is the testing regime can't determine or identify the difference between products containing THC that might be legitimately prescribed and recreational cannabis use.
Just to be clear here, you're testing for presence, not for impairment.
Yes, and this has been one of the ongoing issues we have had with various drug and alcohol testing. There is a clear understanding that recreational drug use, and in particular, and including use of cannabis, does have an impact on people's impairment and ability to perform work safely, particularly in high-risk environments. The limitation attached to determining the level or quantum of impairment has basically meant that organisations in those safety-conscious sectors have needed to adopt a zero-tolerance approach. So that is the assumption that any detection of cannabis suggests that there will be a level of impairment, even though we can't measure that. Now,
there is research suggesting that acute intoxication with THC gives you a level of impairment about equivalent to someone who is sleep impaired. So if you're actually having, say, chronic sleep apnea, or if you had an argument with your wife and you go into work having not slept that night before, you'd have a level of impairment equivalent to having taken some THC. But you're not testing for that before they go on site.
So when it comes to things like worker fatigue, those are issues from a health and safety perspective that businesses are already having to take into consideration. But the approach that we take with respect to dealing with that is quite different. I can't measure fatigue.
What research, what evidence have you based this position on? Because the general evidence and the general instructions and guidelines regards to the prescription of medicinal cannabis are very, very clear at the moment. Mm-hmm. Basically, I think I'm asking, did whoever produced the submission, did they research what the actual requirements are at the moment?
Our focus has very much been on our experience.
Again, it's just a yes or no.
Yeah, sorry, and I'm answering your questions, and as you said, your intention is not to put words in my mouth, so yes. If I could perhaps have the indulgence of explaining my position. Our focus has been, and our experience has been, that there has been significant efforts by a number of individuals aimed to avoid detection of illicit use of drugs in the workplace setting and to take great effort and at great expense to circumvent such policies. Our concern is that, and what we're asking this committee to consider, is in any recommendations that you might provide, that doesn't give those individuals further scope to do so.
It is my understanding that someone who is in chronic pain, taking, say, Panadine Fort, would test positive for opiates, but would be allowed on site with presentation of an appropriate script or a letter from the doctor. Someone who has been treated for ADHD, taking, say, dexamphetamine, would test positive for amphetamines, but would be allowed on site with a letter from a doctor. But what you're proposing here is that cannabis should be treated differently with no exceptions. Am I correct in that understanding?
So one of the things with drug and alcohol testing is the testing for drugs that can differ depending on the type of drug that we're testing for. Some will be with some drugs we'll be able to be in a much better position to identify whether or not the amount that has been detected through the drug and alcohol test is in line with what has been prescribed. And of course, in that case, then in those situations, you have the ability to say, well, yes, this has been prescribed. It's been identified that if they consume that particular drug in the way it has been prescribed, it doesn't pose a safety risk. The drug and alcohol test might pick up a positive reading, but given the nature of that particular drug, it's within the parameters of what has been prescribed, and so therefore there's not a concern of being misused or abused or things like that. Cannabis doesn't allow us to do that, and that's the fundamental concern coming out of this product. And yeah, so it is very much to a certain extent a horses for courses approach about what is appropriate defined amounts or how we can test for these things. We also things like methamphetamines, cannabis, and those are far more problematic drugs as far as recreational drug use. There may be some other ones as well.
Cannabis being problematic, in what way have you assessed that?
So our assessment of that is really coming down to the fact that when we are doing drug and alcohol tests, things like methamphetamine and cannabis tend to be some of the key ones that are being detected.
You are, of course, aware that due to the THC restrictions going on site, that a lot of the people working on site are now using methamphetamine because it clears in the system better, which results in them being sleep deprived when they go to work but not testing positive for drugs, which would impact occupational safety and health, which would be of concern for you. Is that something you have considered in committee?
Well, this is why our viewpoint is towards zero tolerance, as by and large. We are concerned about people substituting one drug for another. That's not to say that one drug is better than the other. And I think that's our fundamental concern.
It'd be fair to say that the legislative framework doesn't permit you to have an entirely zero tolerance approach to drugs and alcohol. If a person has a disability and is taking a lawful medicine, you're not entitled to have a zero drug policy in relation to that medicine. Have to accept that there are medicinal cannabis products that are lawful products. You accept that they are prescribed legitimately by general practitioners.
Yep.
And you accept that some of or overwhelmingly your workplace testing can pick those up in your tests. You accept that?
Yes.
Yes, and you accept that you make a decision about people's ongoing employments based on those testing.
Yeah, so where drug and alcohol policies apply, okay, so it doesn't, not all industries or
No, I understand that.
but in those high risk ones, someone failing a drug and alcohol test will have an impact on their employment.
So do you see the problem that someone, and you've agreed to these propositions, that somebody who has, that medicinal cannabis products are lawful, that they're being appropriately prescribed, that your testing regime is picking them up, and you're making decisions about their ongoing employment based on something that they would otherwise be lawfully entitled to do without interference with their employment, and that is a problem in itself?
So our focus is on those people who are misusing.
No, I'm not interested in misusing people. You have people who are working in the industries that you represent. You purport to represent all employers, and it is a problem that has been illustrated to us by other submissions to this committee, that people who are lawfully taking medicinal cannabis problems are having issues with their ongoing employment because employers are using testing practices that make no difference between impairment and illicit use and their legitimate lawful use of those drugs. So this inquiry is not interested in the illicit use of drugs as a terms of reference. It's not. We're not. One of the terms of reference isn't to look at recreational uses of these drugs. In that regard, it's to look at the pharmaceutical and nutraceutical uses of effectively cannabis and cannabis-related products for lawful reasons. As employers, they have a duty to treat people lawfully. And what I'm suggesting to you, Mr. Moss, is that the approach being taken by your organisation in terms of zero tolerance is not consistent with the current state of the law, which is that you cannot discriminate, put aside the necessary requirements of a position against a person who's taking a lawful medicinal product to treat a health condition because of your fear of other people using illicit drugs in relation to that sort of thing.
So to answer your question to the extent I can determine one in there, do we support people being discriminated against? No, that is not what our submission has been. The focus, and this is one of the things that we that needs to be very mindfully considered. Yes, you're quite right. This committee is not looking at the issue of recreational drug use, okay, and probably quite appropriately so. It's looking at a particular issue as far as the legitimate use of medical-based cannabis products. As identified, the discrimination legislation identifies those protections based on disability or medical impairment. We recognise that. And as far as the advice that we provide to our members when we are dealing with claims about disability discrimination, we are very mindful of those provisions. So we're not certainly in any way, shape or form suggesting that we should have policies that negate such important pieces of legislation. That is not what we are saying. What we are saying, and the point that we are seeking to make, is that the illicit or improper use of drugs is a significant work health and safety risk. And this is something that the WA government, in enacting the Work Health and Safety Act, has clearly recognised. What we are saying is that, or what we are seeking to comment on, is that changes or recommendations that be made by this committee take into account and concern the fact that we're also working very hard to ensure that we have workplaces where people aren't adversely affected.
Sure. But we've already agreed and accepted that your test for THC is not a test of impairment. So that's already an issue in itself. And what I was hoping that we would get from the Peak Employer Association is an acknowledgement of those people who are lawfully using these medicinal cannabis products and the problems that might exist for them continuing in their employment. But it doesn't seem, Mr. Moss, that you are interested in their situation at all. And I don't need you to answer that. That's a position I'm putting to you, and I'll defer to my friend next to me. Or to Ms.
Yes.
Cannabis is a difficult drug in that respect, and for the reasons I've already identified as far as detection of impairment and the like, and the fact that we have situations of people going to great lengths to manipulate drug and alcohol testing to avoid detection. And so that's the position that we're coming from.
So we are aware, of course, and we're very cognizant of the fact that workplace safety is a primary concern. But this would probably be a yes-no answer. Do you currently have a system, an effective operating system for detecting impairment before people go on site?
So if we're looking at cannabis?
No, I'm asking about impairment, not cannabis, just impairment.
So in detecting impairment, it depends on what we're testing for.
Well, the thing about this is, do you have a test for impairment? Could you name the tests for impairment?
So if you're looking at, is there an effective test for determining impairment based on physical observations?
Just impairment.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not a yes or no question, because at the end of the day, it depends on what substance we're talking about. So
you have to be, the substances may have affect impairment. That is true. There could be hundreds, I can name 1,000 substances, but the end result is going to be impairment. Now, impairment on a working site where you have dangerous machinery and people's lives are at risk needs to be assessed. Do you have a test that measures the level of impairment of a worker before they go on site?
If I can perhaps take the time to answer your question, because as I said, it's not a yes or no question. So if we're looking at alcohol, the test for determining impairment will be a blood alcohol concentration above a certain amount, and that amount may well be prescribed based on the type of equipment or machinery or work process that's being used. So to take the motor vehicle example, that is typically 0.05. That is a test for impairment because we can identify.
Excuse me, Mr. Moss, but that is not the question that Dr. Watt asked. Is there a test or is there a criteria that is used for our employer to look and see, is this person impaired or not? We're not talking about testing. We're not talking about the drug testing or thingy, but impairment.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, so the question is there ability to use physical observation to determine impairment? The answer to that is, certainly from a workplace perspective, not one that can easily be applied, because the effect of different drugs is different. So the impact of, say, cannabis on a person is different to methamphetamine, is different from other forms of drugs. The other element here is we're relying on those assessments of impairment to be made, premised on someone who might be a frontline supervisor or line manager or leading hand, people who aren't medically qualified or experienced in that respect.
We do, however, have scientific evidence which suggests that if you do get intoxicated with, say, smoking cannabis, unhealthy way of doing it, but if you did that, the level of impairment exists for 4 hours. This has been measured. It's been scientifically measured. So 5 hours after ingestion, you're not going to have any level of measurable impairment. This is in scientific research. The cannabis, however, the THC, will be detectable in the system for some 4 to 6 weeks later. By your admission, that person who consumed cannabis 4 weeks earlier would still test positive, but would not be impaired, but you'd still ban them from sight. And you're using as an excuse for that, you're saying they might be using drugs illicitly, and therefore will have them banned from sight, without any measure of impairment. Am I correct in that understanding?
So this is the problem that we have. We can't, through the testing regime, identify whether someone took an illicit, using your example, smoked marijuana 30 minutes before going on site, or several days prior. And this has been an ongoing problem associated.
The question, if I may interrupt you, is not whether someone's using illicit drugs. The important question for you is, are they fit to work? And that's so the question of having illicit drugs, you're not a moral police here. You're actually a safeguard for the working force. And I think the two are being conflated, but maybe I'm misunderstanding what your opinion is.
No. So our concern and opinion, or our concern, is with respect to workplace safety. And the concern and the issue that we have is, it's difficult to measure or determine what the level of impairment is, and the drug testing regime doesn't allow us to make those judgments or those assessments. So hence why employers, and this has been reinforced through decisions of both the Fair Work Commission and the Federal Court, have established things like zero tolerance approach, particularly to the use of illicit substances.
My concern, you've put out your concern that people would be using the cannabis and other adulterants to hide their illicit use of drugs, and that's why you're so very keen on stopping people coming on site with THC detectable. My concern, I'm talking as a doctor actually, is that you're allowing people to go on site who are impaired, but you're not detecting that and putting other people's lives and health at risk because the lack of impairment detection. So I'd like you to take that back from me, not from the committee, but from me, to discuss with your colleagues, because I think people's lives are very important on site. I would share that point of view that you put so eloquently across.